I've been in and out of photography for a good portion of my life, but it wasn't until about 6 years ago that I discovered landscape photography. And I didn't go to school for photography or anything related to the visual arts. I taught myself everything I know from reading magazines and books and literally watching as much YouTube content as humanly possible and just making a lot of mistakes, a lot of trial by error, which I find is the best way for me to learn is by making a mistake and identifying that it's a mistake and moving forward and not repeating the same mistake over and over again. And I remember when I first got into landscape photography, making errors, making mistakes that I didn't realize were issues at the time. And I ended up repeating these same mistakes for the first 2 years. And I think that really slowed down my progression and as far as growth. Because I didn't have anyone at the time to tell me, Mark, why are you doing that when you should be doing this? Or Mark, stop doing that and start doing this. And if I had somebody there to help me identify that I was making an issue, I would have been able to solve it, stop doing it, and move forward. And I think it would have overall sped up my progression, which is always a good thing. And that's really the purpose of this week's video, is 5 beginner landscape photography mistakes and how to avoid them. And more specifically, the 5 biggest mistakes that I made when I first got into landscape photography. And to jump right into it, the first one, and these aren't ranked in order of importance or anything like that, but the first one it's kind of twofold. It's related to composition. And the first part of this has to do with images that lack a clear subject matter. I used to take photos all the time that really looked like just snapshots. They didn't look like when you looked at the photograph, you had no idea really what you were looking at or what to look at. Your eye just kind of bounced all over the photograph and you left the photo feeling a little unfulfilled because you don't really know what's the point of the photo. And this is a great example right here. This is an image from 2015. I remember I was super proud of this photograph at the time because it was the first time that I was ever able to slow down the shutter speed and see the effect on water. I was able to finally smooth out the water a little bit, and that was really cool. So I love this photo. And I look at it now, and I really have no idea what's the point of this photo. Is this the subject? Is this the reason this photo was taken, this rock? Or is the main subject matter this island? Or maybe this palm frond? Or maybe the tiny bit of color in the sunset right here? I don't really know what the point of this photo is. In my early years, this is exactly the type of photos that I used to take all the time. It's just these kind of snapshot looking photos that really have no clear subject. And here's a photo that I took just a couple months ago that I think is the complete opposite of that. The moment I look at this photograph, I clearly see this boardwalk that leads me up to this lighthouse. And that's obviously the main point of this photograph. And I'm sure there's secondary subjects, things like the rising sun, the color in the sky, all of the vegetation on both the left and the right side of the boardwalk, this little house by this tree. There's a lot of secondary subjects, but the clear subject matter of this photograph is very obvious, and it's the boardwalk leading up to the lighthouse. And that's fantastic. I love images that are simple like that. And that's my personal preference, that's my opinion, is just to enjoy photographs that have a very clear subject matter, and I feel like they're very defined that way. And here's another example right here. Actually, I took this photo just about 5 months ago on a trip to Moab. And so I still make these mistakes from time to time, but I'm getting a little bit better at it. But I remember standing right here and looking at the scene, and I absolutely loved it. The sun was setting here. It was casting this warm sun all along this cliff face here. And I just loved the whole scene. I loved everything about it. But now that I look at it, there's no clear subject. Is this the main subject, this little tree? My eye, when I look at it, it just bounces around from all of the little distractions on the ground, and I don't really know what to look at. And once again, this is another great example of just a photograph with no clear subject. And this image right here, once again, this is an image. This is the same trip in Moab. This is Canyonlands National Park. Very clear subject. There's this tree. I'm not 100% sure what kind of tree it is, but it's pointing out right to the bend in the river right here. So it's a very clear subject. The point that the reason this photograph was taken is very obvious. So it has a very clear subject. So that's something that really helped me in my progression, is to ask myself when I come up to a scene, why do you want to take this picture? Why are you pointing your camera at this scene? What do you love about it? And once you can answer that question, I would always ask myself, all right, Mark, what's distracting me from what I love about the scene? Because whatever's distracting you from the main subject of the scene is gonna compete for your viewer's eyes as well. So whatever's distracting you is also going to distract the viewer of your photograph. And those are usually things along the edges of your photo. Branches sticking in, twigs sticking in, little trees, rocks, boulders, anything like that. So just kind of walking your eyes around a photograph when you're composing your images is a great best practice to try and eliminate all those little distractions. And usually you can eliminate those things by zooming in a little bit, or maybe just walking a couple steps forward, or sometimes you have to just remove those kinds of distractions in post-processing. But either way, just having a clearly defined main subject and removing distractions is a great way, and it really helped me out. And that was really a big issue that I was having, is just images that were distracting and lacked focus. Now, the second part of this was images that lacked depth. So I was always taking photos, and this is very common. I see this a lot, where beginners will take a photo that have no depth. There's no foreground, there's no midground, there's no background, there's nothing. It literally looks like a flat image, which you really want to create 3-dimension and create depth, almost that you can reach into the photograph. That's what you want. And here's a great example of this. Once again, I remember being super proud of this photo, but and there is a little bit of foreground, I guess, this wheat grass, or I'm not sure what kind of grass it is, but there's grass in the foreground. But then this tree is right up on this hillside, and it just drops off. So this entire image, there's literally no depth in this photograph at all. And then this photo right here clearly has something in the immediate foreground. There's a lot of things in the midground, and you can actually see the beginning of this stream all the way at the top here, and it just winds all the way through to this nice S-curve here. So there's a lot of depth in this photograph. Like, you can literally reach in and grab the beginning of the stream, and that's something that I really like in a photograph, and I pay a lot of attention to that now. But back then, I never did at all. I never even paid attention to creating depth. And here's another image right here. I think this is also from 2015. Once again, no depth. This just looks like a snapshot. There's no real, everything looks like it's behind this birdhouse. So there's no foreground, and it's really hard to kind of create depth that way when there's really no foreground at all. And here's another example here. A great subject in the foreground, very strong element in the foreground. This area right here kind of points down to the breaking waves in the midground, and of course you have the mountains in the background. So there's a clear pattern there. Whenever you can put something in the foreground, that's a great way to anchor the photograph, draw visual interest from the viewer, and allows them to kind of walk their eye through your photograph. And that's something I never used to do. And here's another example. This is just some random grass with these very subtle leading lines that kind of draw your eye to this grass and kind of walk the viewer's eye up here to Corona Arch in the background. So once again, there's a little bit of depth there. And I know that sometimes you can't create depth. Sometimes there's not a foreground element around, or maybe not even a midground. A lot of times this happens with the telephoto lens, and telephoto lens is one of my favorite types of lenses to shoot with. And this is a great example of that. There's no foreground here at all, and there's really no background either. There's literally just this. But for me, this image works because there's these shadows and the reflections in the tree trunks. The reflecting tree trunks kind of draw your eye up here to the actual mainland of the lake. And a lot of times I found success focusing on light and shadows and reflections when you don't have any foreground or midground or background, when there's no depth. If you lean on light and shadows, that can kind of help you out as well. And this is a great example. I actually just posted this image to Instagram. I think it was just last week. Once again, telephoto lens, I think it was zoomed all the way into 200. No foreground, no midground, really no background. This is all just looks like background. But the shadows and the light through here kind of give it a little bit more added depth. And I really feel like that helps it here. So whenever you don't have any type of foreground or midground or background and everything just kind of looks flat, if you just focus on light and shadows, that can definitely help you out. Now, the second thing that really held me back had to do with the fact that I wasn't using my camera to its fullest, specifically the light meter. The cameras today are shipped with the amount of power that they have is really insane. The dynamic range they have, but more specifically, the light meter and the histogram. And when I first got into photography, I had never paid attention to either of those. And I know the histogram can be a little bit intimidating, but the light meter, the thing at the bottom of your screen that I think it usually starts at 0 in the middle and it goes down from -1 to -5 on one side and +1 to +5 on the other. And based on the brightness or the darkness of your scene, the little upside down arrow at the top will move to the left and right. So if it's darker, the upside down arrow will point in the negative range. If your image is brighter, it'll point in the positive range. And the ultimate goal is, technically speaking, is to have that upside down arrow at 0, because that's the camera saying that the image is perfectly exposed. It's not always the case. I never shoot like that. I always have my light meter usually a full stop, if not more, underexposed, just because I'm comfortable with the dynamic range of my camera. And I know how much shadow detail I can pull out, and I always expose for the highlights. But I never paid attention to that light meter until my second year. I completed 2 years. It was my third year of photography before I even knew what that little dancing upside down triangle was at the bottom of my LCD screen. And that really, it helped me out tremendously. And then once I started to focus on that, I started to focus on the histogram. Not so much to create that perfect looking histogram, but just to look at the histogram to ensure that I'm not blowing out or overexposing areas of my sky, because that was an issue that I really struggled with. I didn't shoot in full auto, which was good. I was shooting in aperture priority almost all the time. And my camera was saying that these images were properly exposed, but I was still getting these hot spots in the sky all the time where the highlights were blown out or overexposed. So once I started to pay attention to the light meter and my histogram, mainly just to make sure that I wasn't overexposing anything, not only was I creating better photographs that were more usable because I didn't have to do so much post-processing to try and save those overly exposed areas. So I was creating better photos, but it also just helped me to understand mentally the exposure triangle, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and how they relate to one another. Because I would see that my light meter was a little bit overexposed. So that would tell me that I need to pick a smaller aperture. Or maybe I need to increase my shutter speed just to not let as much light into the center, to not have my image so overexposed. So just paying attention to your light meter and your histogram, probably the most important part, creating better photos, but also just understanding exactly how your camera works from an exposure perspective. Now, the third thing has to do, and this is a big one, has to do with the time of day that I was shooting. Now, I knew from the very get-go when I got into landscape photography that I need to shoot sunrise and sunset, and I did that a lot. But I also ended up spending hours and hours and hours shooting in the midday sun, and it just didn't do me any favors. But I do think that shooting in the midday sun is probably better than not shooting at all, especially when you're a beginner, to get out and just shoot as much as humanly possible. There's no bad time to shoot. As long as you're shooting, that's good. But I wasn't being productive, I guess that's the way to say it. My best images were never coming from the midday shoots. It was always coming at sunrise and sunset. And here's a couple great example images. This is an image from a trip from last week. Very nice, soft light. The sun had already set on this side. It was already down behind the mountains. But you could just see just the residual soft ambient light just casting up on this cliff face. And then now the next image here is going to be from just, I think, 2 hours earlier. And you can see how harsh this light is, how contrasty this scene is, and it just looks completely different. So here it is about 20 minutes after sunset, and here it is about an hour and a half before sunset. So completely different. And that just really goes to show you time of day is everything. And here's another example here. This is in, I think this is in Arches National Park. And as you can see, this is right as the sun was rising. I was able to capture this right before it got above this cloud deck here, but it casts this nice warm light all across through here. And then this image is about 30 minutes later. Completely different, completely flat light. So this was the good light, and then this was the not so good light. So the time of day is really, really critical to getting the good photos. I still say there's no bad time to shoot as long as you're shooting and getting that practice, and that's always a good thing. But the majority of your best images will probably come from sunrise and sunset times, or before and after those times as well. So that took me a while to figure that one out as well before I kind of got more focused on the golden hour times of the day. Now, the fourth one And this is once again a very big one. It has to do with spending too much time and money focusing on gear. And this is a pretty personal one for me, because this really impacted me. And I'll tell you a short story. When I got back into photography in 2015, I bought a Nikon D31, or no, I think 3200, maybe 3300, whatever it was. It was about $400 for the kit. And I used it for 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, instead of practicing and learning everything about that camera, I researched other cameras. That's all I did. In 2 weeks, I returned my Nikon camera and upgraded. I went from a $400 3200, let's call it, to a $2,000 full frame Nikon D750. I guess I felt that the crop sensor was holding me back, and I needed to get a full frame camera. And I did that. And I used that for about 2 months. And in those 2 months, instead of practicing constantly and obsessing over the manual and learning every detail about that camera, what did I do? I researched different cameras. And I wanted to figure out what's the better gear I could have. And I ended up selling the D750 in 2 months and upgrading to the state-of-the-art mirrorless cameras, the Sony A7R Mark II. So I went from a $2,000 setup to like a $3,500 setup. This is all in the span of just a few months when I just got into photography, into landscape photography. And I was just constantly researching gear and spending tons of money on gear instead of just using the gear I have and practicing and getting out there and making photos. And the point of all this is that I wish I would have just used my Nikon D3200 and saved all that money I spent on the gear and just went somewhere, traveled, just put that money in experiences and not gear. Because I guarantee you, if I would have taken an image at, say, Yosemite with my Nikon D3200, that image, whatever image I would have got from there, would have been better than any image I would have taken with my $3,500 Sony A7R Mark II that I took in my local town, because I didn't have any money to go anywhere. Because location is everything too. I mean, all cameras today, they're great. They're all good. They're all going to create fantastic photographs, but nothing can replace just practice and traveling around, especially for landscape photographers, and going to these beautiful places and capturing these experiences and these photographs and these memories. So spending less time focusing on gear and spending money on gear and taking that money and that focus and putting it towards learning whatever camera you have and traveling around and investing in it and experiences. Now, the fifth one has to do with the fifth real mistake that I used to make was I would always shoot at eye level. Every photo was like this. Every time I would come to a scene, put the tripod or just put the camera right up to my eye, everything was at eye level. This is an easy one to fix. Ultimately, just stop doing that is what I told myself. Stop putting it eye level. And what I started to do is when I would get to a scene, don't get your camera out, don't put your tripod out, and just spend a lot of time, an hour if you can, before the good light, or as much time before the good light comes, just looking around your composition, every angle, just really feel it out. And once you get comfortable with the area and you know what you love about the scene and you know what's distracting you about the scene and you know exactly how you want to capture it, then pull your camera out. But ultimately, don't put it right on the tripod. You know, just look around different compositions. Maybe point it up, maybe point your camera down. Set your tripod really low, set it up high maybe, or put your tripod low and point it down. Or, I mean, the possibilities are endless. But ultimately, just getting creative with your overall composition really helped me out because I never paid attention to it. I literally just put the tripod up to eye level. I would actually put it to a level to where it was comfortable for my back, so I didn't have to hunch over. That's how I created my images, because I don't have the best back. So all of my images used to be shot at 6'1", almost to where my eye is. And that's the way I did everything. So just getting more creative, taking your time with your compositions to really refine exactly what you're trying to do. Now, and this is kind of a bonus thing. This is a sixth tip and I see this happen a lot, is not shooting in RAW. I spent probably the first 18 months not shooting in RAW, just editing JPEGs. This is very simple to fix. It's just a simple setting on your camera. But I would definitely encourage anyone who's getting into any type of photography, if you're editing your photos, just flip that switch in your camera to RAW. You'll not only learn a lot more about post-processing, but you'll understand the power of your camera, things like dynamic range and how far you can push these photographs. So definitely, get out of JPEG, start shooting in RAW a little bit. And that's definitely something that I wish I would have done from the very get-go, because I think it would have sped up my overall progression, especially from a post-processing aspect. So those are really the 5 or 6 biggest issues that I had, biggest mistakes that I made, and how I fixed those. And I hope you were able to get at least one good tip out of that. And as always, if you have any questions, definitely leave them in the comments section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And as always, I definitely appreciate you watching this week's video, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.